So
You
we
don't need to
are.
see me anyways.
Well, no, you do good hand motions and such. Some people watch them.
The
Um,
sound effects.
yeah. So hi, Wayne Dorband and Mark Shepard from Colorado and Wisconsin. And Mark's been traveling, and he might talk a little bit about that. I've been traveling. I know over the weekend he was up in Maine, and he's actually got a couple stories he'll either tell tonight or another about some looking at some results of his work that he did 30 years ago. And so that was cool. I was out in California working on an aquaculture project that I've talked a little bit about. It's the fish farm in California, and that's New Global Energy. Mark's going to be working on that project at some point too, because it's got a terrestrial portion of it, and exciting projects and some great people out there we're working with. Hope all of you have got folks that you're either with or that you're going to work with that you enjoy. And again, this is the Economic Action Team Restoration Agriculture session. And I'm not going to do a whole lot more introduction-wise. Most of you know Mark, and if you don't, he's going to give a little bit of a review at the front end of this, as he does always, and then get right into his series that he's been doing on forest ecology. So I'll just turn it right over to you, Mark. Go for it.
All right, hi there, everybody. Hope my camera's on straight because I can't see myself in this. That's all right, I don't need to.
You look great.
That's more I can say for you, pal. And now he's throwing me off. I've lost my cadence and everything. It's a disaster. Anyways, we've been talking forest ecology. We've talked some of the basic terminology that we've used. We've talked a little bit about system change, different ways to categorize ecosystems around the planet, different ecoclimatic zones, etc. The conditions that lead to the formations of certain plant communities. We talked more specifically last week about specific plant communities, and as usual, none of this isn't just an expose on forest ecology and how plant communities work on planet Earth. My whole focus of being is how do we as human beings live on this planet in an ecologically responsible manner. Now, why did not my slides advance? There we go. My first inspiration was Tree Crops, J. Russell Smith. It was originally written in 1926. I read it first probably in the early 1980s with the introduction by Wendell Berry. What he said about this book, I really resonate with. It's a great book to rummage about in. You can pick it up and just open it up somewhere and read about, persimmons or read about mulberries and how to use them in a two-story agricultural system, growing our animal feed up above, pasture down below, saving the flattest, most fertile soil for annual crops agriculture. First place I ever saw the words permanent and agriculture together got me thinking, how can we live on this planet without destroying it? How can we live while actually improving the health of the ecological systems that support us here? I ran into the word permaculture not too long after that. This was the first edition, hardcover edition of Permaculture Designer's Manual. As you can see, I wore mine almost completely out. I then loaned it to some folks in Tanzania, and they have worn it further out, and I swear they've memorized half the pages. One of the things that I had heard about permaculture and why I come from the perspective of permaculture is that our aim is to create systems that are ecologically sound and economically profitable. Ecologically sound, if we do ecological systems, put them in the proper context, we cannot fail because that's what nature does. Right there are these types of systems. We'll arrange them a little bit differently and we'll interact with them differently. If we do that, we have no maintenance expenses, very little maintenance expenses. We now have a system that's economically profitable. Ecologically sound, economically profitable, ecolonomics. Kind of makes sense, almost. Now it won't advance again. There we go. And I just found this one today. This one flew around Facebook, and I've heard this phrase before, that the philosophy behind permaculture is one of working with rather than against nature, of protracted and thoughtful observation rather than protracted and thoughtless action, and looking at systems in all of their functions rather than just asking only one yield, and then of allowing the systems to demonstrate their own evolutions. You guys will see tonight exactly what I'm talking about when I'm mentioning protracted and thoughtful observation. That phrase right there has been interpreted differently by many permaculturists. I take a different approach to that, and you'll see some evidence in here tonight. We'll go through a little bit of it. The landscape itself gives you clues as to what it's been doing for the past 25, 50, 100,000, 10,000, sometimes even longer than that. The place where you are right now has all of those clues embedded right in it, in the rocks, in the soil, in the shape of the earth, in the trees, the shapes of the trees, whether they're bending in the wind. So observation isn't like sitting down and looking at your navel for like 5 years and waiting for you all of a sudden to come up with these answers. It's knowing what to look at to get all of the answers that tell you how has this place been operating ecologically for the past 5, 10, 15, 20,000 years, etc. And then to looking at them as systems, not crops. We're not looking at things as a walnut crop or an apple orchard. We're looking at an ecological system and allowing to have its own type of evolution and trajectory forward through time. And we figure out how do we interact with that to obtain multiple yields from that system. So of course, permaculture is applied through a set of principles. Most of them originally were written down by David Holmgren in that book there. And basically where we're at right now is observing, imitating, and interact. If we're going to follow this principle number one, and this is one that many permaculturists give lip service to, but have missed the point when you come right down to it. If we're going to observe nature, we need to really know what we're looking at. Hence, however long this webinar series is going to be, hence a webinar series on basic ecology of perennial and woody systems, forest ecology. And we'll get to all those other ones. I don't just use a permaculture designer's manual that I read. I trained at Unity College in Maine, had way more different textbooks than this. I am a collector of ecological textbooks. And the one that we're working mostly out of right now is this one in the center here, Forest Ecology, and then Wisconsin's Natural Plant Communities. I got another word that somebody from Maryland found, Maryland's Natural Plant Communities book. So look for your state a similar type book here that describes the natural plant communities. Because if you imitate what does well in your place all by itself, you'll have a pretty good chance of it succeeding. And you can develop a property that looks like this. Now, where you start is going to be different. You may start, as I'll talk later on at the end of the session here, you may start with a clear cut. You may start with a parking lot. You may start with agricultural land. You may start with an already, an abandoned farm or whatever. This property here was started, about 60% of it was corn, beans, and hay rotation. This property that I've got the arrows on, do you guys see my cursor swirling around there, Wayne?
Yep, yeah, I can. And no, it looks good. By the way, this is the first time you've used this picture that I see the wing of the plane. I always thought it was a drone, and there wasn't the wing there. So, quick comment, it lets you take a breath. You know what would be really cool? And the fellow from Maryland was great to put in what he did. Any of you out there, if you don't mind, add on the Facebook page for the community, or send me an email or put it on a comment here on this page as this becomes a replay, those kinds of guides for your particular area. If we all do that kind of research, then we don't all have to do it, one of us do it, and then it becomes valuable for everybody. Just a thought. So I'll jump back off again.
Yeah, that's a great idea, yeah. Yeah, and so if you look at these corn, beans, alternating strips, they extended out over this particular ridge of the farm and they went over into this property here, all the way across this area. I'm pointing with my finger now, and it's not really quite working. One of the interesting things, we'll deal with it later, not anytime soon, but on the water management, here we have a perennial system. This is pasture. A lot of folks say, yeah, but I'm a rotational grazer. I'm growing pasture. It's perennial. There's no more erosion. Well, excuse me, folks. What on earth is this stuff here? You will get erosion. We'll deal with that later. So it was about 30 years worth of my own personal experience. First of all, educated as an ecologist, and then I went out into the planet itself and I jumped. I just jumped right off the edge of the world and says, I will derive my economic livelihood by interacting with nature and natural systems and deriving a livelihood in an ecological manner. And it started with actually homesteading in Alaska. I showed some of those pictures. And then followed shortly thereafter with the purchase of a clear cut, which ended up being, I believe, 5 different clear cuts, all adjacent to one another in northeastern Maine, that myself, my wife, and brother-in-law all purchased as a limited partnership. So this book right here is a distillation of 30 years worth of actually living the experience on the ground. I've had several academics argue with some of the points that I make in the book. Well, they're arguing out of a framework that they learned in a book, in class, online. I am sharing what I've experienced on the real planet, in the real world, and one of the unique aspects of this particular approach here in the regenerative community, in the permaculture community, you look at all the different teachers who are out there, there is only one person there who has derived their economic livelihood from producing food, fuels, medicines, and fibers in permaculture systems for the past 30 years of their life, and you're sitting at a webinar with them right now. And does that mean anything? I actually think it does, because if you actually have experience, I'm not just parroting things that I read in a book. I may be referencing books, but then what I do is I explain how is it real? How did it play out on the ground in my experience through the past umpteen years? And this is the basic protocol that all of us are going to come up with and follow on our properties. We're going to identify our biome, which is the process that we're in right now. Then later on, we'll manage our water, establish woody perennial polycultures, build fences, roads, utilities, agroforestry, manage fraternity. And then we started with what's fascinating. I was thinking about this quite a bit today. It's like the forest. You know, I rib people for using the term food forest because from one of the definitions of forest, it's a closed canopy, not a lot of light penetration, it's fewer layers, there's less total photosynthesis going on because it's all in the canopy. Whereas I work more with savanna systems that are between 30 and 60% canopy closure, there's still a grassy component, and it's heavy with mammals. Well, the even broader term of forest is basically any ecosystem anywhere. Even a grassland technically is a forest. It's just an early successional forest. It's not quite fully treed yet. We'll see a little bit later on, like this one right here. Just because a forest isn't there now doesn't mean that one won't grow there, and it doesn't mean that it's not already obeying these observable phenomena called forest ecology. All plant communities change through time. One of the things that's you can observe over and over again, it started simply with yeast in sugar water. Any organism in place will change that place so that over time it will make that place uninhabitable for itself. You put the yeast in with the sugar water, it consumes it as fast as it can, it overpopulates, it pollutes its environment with its own effluents, and its populations crash. That's a classic pattern no matter where you look on planet Earth, no matter what the organisms are, all organisms change their environment to a certain extent. One of our goals, I think, as humans, is to understand that. We change our environment as we interact with it. Well, how do we optimize its function? How do we work with it, interact with it, accept feedback from it? We have to understand how these systems change through time. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight and probably next session as well. And we'll need to learn how it changes through different kinds of time scales. Now, if you look at this farm right here, it's got contour terraces on it. It's mostly wheat. This is a property, I believe this is in Iowa, where this aerial photograph was taken. It's one from the 1970s. That particular farm right there will change over time, especially if we add this wild card to it called a human being. Then we add a human being who happens to be a restoration agriculture, permaculture, whatever you call that type of person, who's now planting perennial woody polycultures in that place. It will change through time. The change that I've experienced on my farm that originally looked like that on this right here that this farm here looked like this. The changes that occurred from a place that looked like this to a place that looks like this is short term. I've only been there 20 years. That's called succession. Changes in the species composition, the structure, the shape, the physiognomy, appearance of it, total biomass on site of the resident vegetation above and below ground, the non-woody species that will start to show up magically, miraculously. I saw a weasel today. I have no exactly idea what kind it was. It was about this big. I think we got like 4 different species of weasel around here, and some of them I had never really even heard of until we had moved here. So other organisms will show up opportunistically to occupy the niches that we create in our farming system. So the short-term change is called succession. And this farm right here, in the foreground, if this is the property that you just purchased right now, we're now going to transform this, do a restoration agriculture farm. We know that. If we just walk away from it, it will eventually turn into something like this. In part because all of these seeds are going to be migrating over into this spot. Wind will be blowing some seeds over. Some seeds will get hooked to the fur of animals. Some seeds will be ingested with food, especially fruits, and then excreted in a nice little pile of manure. Various different ways that seeds will move through a landscape. One of the things that you will want to do when you go to a place is observe all of the plants that are around you. And one of the reasons why it's so important to imitate the natural systems of your place is that these systems right here, they are constantly going to be imposing upon this place right here. If you go plant wheat or corn or even a pasture here, these seeds are constantly going to be invading here. So you will have to work with the fact that there's a certain amount of biotic inertia. You'll be driven by these seeds telling you what to do. So you might as well choose these plants, or their cousins, closely related cousins, and then organize them in a way that you want them. So it's basically this system moving out into, what happened there? That's wild. Is that system here moving out into this field here. This system right here, set up with terraces. This is also in north central Iowa to manage the water. Now, if they start planting a system around here, they're not going to have the same biotic inertia issues that this previous system did, because they've got the woods right here. There's probably lots of wildlife. There's lots of reasons for seed to be colonizing this new spot. Not as many seeds coming in here. I work with some folks in northwestern Minnesota that they can abandon a field for eons and hardly anything grows there except for a couple of little grasses and thistles, simply because there's nothing around them throwing seeds at them all the time. Whereas up in northeastern Maine, where I was just at last week, if you have a clearing, if you have a garden, for example, if you turn your back on it once, I mean, the trees are 6 foot tall already. You can't fight them back practically. There's that biotic inertia driving it. What has changed this appearance to this appearance is succession, and that's really important that we understand it. Managing succession in our system is what it's all about. We're not necessarily a crop manager or a livestock manager. We're the manager of a system or a suite of processes that follow a particular successional pathway. A couple things I wanted to point out here with succession. It's the basic process of the change in plant communities in a place and the animal communities that are deriving a livelihood from those plant communities. It's the change in that place over time. Roughly broken up into 2 different kinds of succession. Primary succession is taking bare rock, like we see over here, and eventually turning into the first phase of being vegetated. We've shown some pictures in the past with lichens and mosses on the bare rock. They decompose, grasses can get established, and now we have some soil. That's primary succession. And then secondary succession is this basically vegetated phase now moving in other different directions. And what's interesting is the whole idea of succession came about really during the 40s and 50s when there was a lot of gung-ho enthusiasm, and people knew what was right, and every problem could be solved, and technology had all the answers in the world. And when we looked at nature, nature was thought to be fixed, and certain places were finished. Like the redwoods in California, these redwood groves, these are the climax forest, and that's it. It will never change from that ever again. That's very linear. It's very short-sighted, even if you're talking a redwood grove of 5,000 years. Things aren't linear completely, and things don't hit a finished phase. Like whoever wrote this one here, you start with a mature oak hickory forest. It was a climax forest, and it's there forever. Well, the mature forests that were here in North America when the Europeans showed up were only at best 400 or 500 years old on the East Coast, because that's when 400 or 500 years prior to the permanent settlement of Europeans was when Columbus would have first showed up and spread all these diseases. And so the savanna-type appearance that was maintained mostly by fire and grazing animals, the people who took care of that kind of went away, so it all grew up to forest. And when the Europeans showed up, they said, wow, this is what this place is, what it should be, it's supposed to be, is old-growth forest. That was only a brief temporary phenomena that in North America has only been like the 500 years from Columbus until the turn of the 20th century. That's the only time when this continent has had the opportunity to close the canopy that much. So here they have farmland abandoned up in the upper left. Starts with the annual plants, grasses, perennials. Your coarse woody herbs start to come in. Well, then, what pines? What do you mean pines? Where did those pines come from? This is out of context. How, if you had a mature oak hickory forest that was destroyed, where the hell did the pines come from? There had to have been some pines around somehow. So this is a little bit of a illusory type thing, but the general appearance is true. This is generally what happens. What this should be more is sun-loving trees or sun-demanding trees, and then later on will be shade-tolerant trees. Well, then you become a mature oak hickory forest. Well, nowadays it's known, of course, that if you have a mature oak hickory forest, it creates a deep shade. As the oaks and the hickories get old and start to fall over, son of a gun, there's no regeneration of oak and hickory anymore. Well, that's because oak and hickory gets established back here. They need the sun to get established. And if you have this pine phase in the middle that shades it all out, you wouldn't get oak and hickory. So what will happen is the oak and hickory fall over, then you'll have shade tolerance, basswood, sugar maple, eastern hemlock if you have it around. Other places where the secondary succession, an already vegetated place, this was already vegetated where it was forest and it was cleared for agriculture. This was forest and then burned by catastrophic fire. Goes through the phase. This is, I like how this lays out these pioneer species. The pioneer species are very opportunistic. They tend to produce lots of seed, lots of hard seed that doesn't rot right away, doesn't sprout right away, needs particular conditions to do it. These pioneer species, our annual grains are classic pioneer species. And there's intermediate species. And what's interesting is my farm in Wisconsin is categorized primarily by these intermediate species, mostly sun-loving species. This mature oak hickory forest is an intermediate phase. So this phase here, this shrubland going to oak hickory forest, is the same right in here. It's intermediate, and that these two phases will eventually be replaced by more shade-tolerant systems that come in. And this one down the bottom shows it a lot more betterer, that eventually you have these shade-tolerant trees that will dominate the site. Well, it doesn't stop there. It keeps going, because here comes another fire, or here comes a tornado, or here comes a herd of mastodons, or here comes a flock of yellow bulldozers and skidders. There's some kind of earthquake, mudslide, tsunami. There's all different kinds of disturbances that will change this. Understanding this process of succession and how it's played out in your climate, on your soil type, with your suite of species that are there, understanding the process of succession is basically how you will farm a property successfully, because you're now going to plug yourself into the natural process of vegetation development on that site. And the successional pathway of your ecoregion and how we interact with it is what determines our crop mix. If you live in Maine, for example, yes, you can grow saguaro cactus because you took a permaculture course, you can modify the microclimate, this, that, and the other thing. Or, and this is a classic example, I know it'll get Wayne going anyways. I worked with a client in north central Alberta. Now, if anyone knows where north central Alberta is, it's like almost up by the Arctic Circle. That means it's very, very cold, and summer is very, very short. Tremendous amount of light in the summertime. It's an interior climate. There's no oceans to modify it, so it gets extremely hot in the summer and extremely cold in the winter. He's trying to grow tilapia indoors in buildings. And he's wondering why he's going bankrupt trying to come up with enough money to produce enough light and enough heat to keep these fish alive in the wintertime. Like, well, time out. You missed number one. He failed to observe what was actually a successful plant nano community in his place and pick things that are appropriate for his place. Wherever you are, there is an appropriate mix of species for your place. And as we talked about with the section on the climactic ecoregions, is pretty much the underlying bedrock and climate. Those two combined are basically almost fixably determining what plants will grow there and what physiognomy, what appearance, what structure that plant community will take is almost set in stone. We can tweak with it a little bit at the edges and where different zones bump into each other, but what you see outside is what would probably be best to imitate. Try growing like an Arctic fish in the Arctic instead of a tropical fish in the Arctic. And if you see this right here, we've got another successional pathway, and this one includes jack pine, black spruce, aspen, it's got haith, and finishes with balsam fir, paper birch, white spruce forest community. This right here is almost what occurs in northeastern Maine. This is very north central Minnesota, Michigan, southern central Canada, Manitoba, Ontario. In northeastern Maine, this community here would eventually be undergrown by beech, very shade, and sugar maple. Those would be the two that would come to dominate the site more often. Here's just a good visual pictorial representation. And one of the things is and I recommend this, is start reading genuine research papers on different kinds of successional pathways, different kinds of interactions. I know that when I've taught a lot of permaculture courses, the idea of competition between organisms was poo-pooed. It's like, oh, no, that's not how the universe works. You know, plants and animals don't compete with one another. They cooperate with one another. It's like, well, you can observe competitive effects between organisms. You can also, find mutualistic effects between organisms, and you can see neutral effects. You can see facilitation, that's where they help one another, and competition. All of those are observable in nature. So don't just say it's one or the other. Try to understand what is making your place tick. How is it working? How are the different organisms together? It's not just competition. It's not just facilitation or commensalism or mutualism. It's a blend of all of those working together, and then we throw in this beautiful, delicious wild card called humans. And we have a will. We can make choices. We can make choices based on emotions that we have. We can make choices based on concepts that we have, just these ideas that we apply to the earth, or we can make decisions based on rational thinking. We have a whole bunch of different ways that we can come to a decision, and then we affect this whole successional pathway. But the long and short of it, imitate the natural plant communities of your eco region, and this pathway will happen. There is a ecological successional pathway everywhere on the planet. Some things that limit it are cold temperatures, hot temperatures, lack of moisture, excessive moisture. Those will tend to drive the system. Presence of animals, lack of animals, all those things are factors that affect the development. I don't know if you've seen some of the posts recently. I'm going to be doing a restoration ag workshop at a vegan community later on this fall. Well, you can have a vegan community and you can manage an ecosystem without the use of domesticated animals and without eating animals that are in the system. However, there's no place on planet Earth where a system an ecological system is at all where there are no animals. And there is no way that I know of for human beings to interact with a place without killing animals. So they will be utilizing animals in their system, whether they want to or not. And so what is in your best interest, if you're not going to kill and consume animals for food, is to understand what animals are there, how do they interact with your system, how do you utilize them to optimize the overall health and productivity of your system. So all that said, you see we've got a lot of moving parts going on. Well, now in order to understand short-term succession, which is the decades to centuries, it's one lifetime, that's short-term succession, we also need to be aware of its context, its big grand picture. How does the current succession of what's going on in New Forest Farm in southwest Wisconsin, how does that fit into the big picture spanning geological eons? Pink sugar water. So we did the definition of succession back here. Where did it go? There we go. Big ecosystem change through a range of decades to centuries with the change in species composition, structure, and biomass. That's succession. Well, if we start talking about the vegetation change, the spatial arrangement, and genetic changes within the population over thousands to millions of years, those are plant migration, speciation, and evolution. So if you can imagine, look outside your window, you look at these plant communities that are around you right now, I'm looking at mine, those plant communities have changed location through time. Seed has been moved by animals, been blown by wind, and the populations themselves will tend to thrive in the places that have more favorable conditions and not thrive in places that have unfavorable conditions. And so over time, these plant communities have moved around the planet, and they've changed. We'll talk a little bit about how that occurs later on. Now, our management decisions today, what we do today, affects succession, which is a short-term change. It affects plant migration, speciation, and even evolution long-term. And hopefully I'll deal with this a little bit later on. The speciation and plant migration, just think right now of your own particular place and the ideas that you have of how to set up an ecological system. One of the things that I did in southwest Wisconsin, imitating the oak savanna, oak, chestnut, and beech are all cousins. I went with chestnut, a choice simply because they would produce crops more regularly. Chestnut was not necessarily native to my area, so I got some from surrounding areas. I went far and wide to find all of the chestnut genetics that I could possibly take, and I moved them to this one particular place. Here's plant migration. You know, that population, chestnut, had not existed in my area, had not existed for millennia, zillennia, however long. And as far as speciation is concerned, chestnuts that had migrated into moisture climates or colder climates or hotter tropical climates, all of a sudden their offspring were grabbed, recombined, and put this place in Wisconsin. And what's going to come out of my place in Wisconsin are different types of chestnut that have never existed before on planet Earth, because I've got Chinese, Japanese, Seguin, European, American chestnuts all put together, and whoever is the most reproductively successful on that site gets to persist. So plant migration, we are actual vectors. We can move plant communities around. We do. We've done it all over the place. And the speciation, we actually have the ability to change the plant's appearances and their actual genetics, not through any kind of weird scientific gene splicing, gene gun technology, but just through putting these guys next to each other, and they pollinate one another. This could have been from Siberia, this could have been from China, and this could have been from South America. Now you've got these three existing side by side in North America, and these little offspring have never existed genetically before because those plants never had the opportunity to pollinate with one another. So our decisions today affect the overall ecosystem health, predator-prey relationships, pest and disease cycles. One of the Sepp Holzer videos online, I forget which one it is, talks about at one point in time, country of Austria did a a little survey of all the endangered species in Austria. And they found out that, wow, lo and behold, out of all of the endangered species, 90% of them showed up on Sepp Holzer's farm because he has this incredibly diverse ecosystem with plenty of water. All kinds of different niches have been capitalized upon and exploited in the ecological terms. Then there was a subsequent research that was done, and they were finding out that there were several endangered species that the majority of their population was on Sepp Holzer's farm. I was in Nebraska City, Nebraska at the Arbor Day farm a number of years ago. I participated in the planting of 9 acres of hazelnuts, excuse me, in front of their conference center. And we were doing some follow-up research with them. And what we were doing at that time is we were trialing a blueberry harvester to see if it would harvest hazelnuts. It worked, fairly well. But what was happening is we had the blueberry harvester going through the rows of trees, and we were filming the 4 corners of the harvester. My corner, everything was fine. It was working flawless. So I looked back at the other guy. He kind of shrugs his shoulders. Everything's fine. So we go around the back. We had insect people there and bird people and this, that, and the other thing. Well, this one guy freaks out. He's like, oh my gosh, turn the machine off. There's walking sticks here. And it's like, so? Well, evidently walking sticks are an endangered species in Nebraska. And then after a while, it's like, yeah, but the machine's not harming them. They're just coming through and crawling out, so that's okay. We're not killing any walking sticks. He's like, well, I guess that's all right. And then the harvester moved down the row further. He's like, wow, that's a lot of walking sticks. And after a while, it's like, wow, that's a real lot of walking sticks. The next year, he actually got money to research that place, and he found out that that 9-acre field was the home to 90% of the walking sticks in the state of Nebraska. And so what he did, he summarily stopped all research on walking sticks specifically related to that spot because he found so many walking sticks in this restoration agriculture 9-acre field that if they had counted them all, it would have delisted the walking stick as a critically endangered organism, and it would lose any kind of legal protection. So what we're going to be doing is genuine ecological restoration. We are affecting predator-prey relationships and animal populations way off into the future. How many incalculable thousands of different interactions are going on that we'll never see and never know about, and they'll last literally for thousands of years. I kid you not. I like to joke sometimes during tours that what I'm doing on my farm is so good that it's going to take a bulldozer to undo all the good that I do. And speaking of bulldozer and all the good, this little tree right here, it probably won't last very long. It's a pure American chestnut. This was taken a month ago when it was in full bloom. This is probably going to be its last big year of a heavy crop of seeds. Its seeds can't be considered pure American because it's surrounded by all these different other, China, like I said, Chinese Seguin, European crosses between all of those. So its offspring are clearly hybridized American, whatever else offspring. But the point is this tree here could actually persist for thousands and thousands of years. Its root system, which is at least equally as big in the ground, is changing the soil food web. It's changing the carbon balance. It's pumping carbon down into the soil with its roots. There are decomposer organisms. There's fuzz on the inside of a chestnut burr. You open it up, there's a little bit of fur. It feels like a horse's nose. There's a fungus that its sole substrate is the fuzz inside of chestnut burrs. And there's a guy up in University of Wisconsin La Crosse who he's a mushroom freak. He's one of the professors there, and that's one of the things he discovered is like, how on earth did this fungus show up in southwest Wisconsin when there haven't been chestnuts for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, within hundreds of miles of this place? We have changed this place, and the change may be in place for practically forever. And one of the reasons why I say practically forever is look at that tree there. This little tree has ambitions to look like that one right there. That's my favorite tree in the whole wide world. That's El Castagno de Centocavalli, the 100-horse chestnut tree. It has the largest trunk of any tree ever measured. It's about 75 yards across at the bottom of the trunk. It used to be much, much taller when the trunk was measured, and it set the record as being the largest tree trunk ever. some vandals immediately came out and burned it down. So the main central core burned down, but there's a ring of stump sprouts around it that are all of these little sprouts coming off the stump are gigantic sprouts. Approximately 4,000 years old. Go look up the list of the 10 oldest trees on the planet. One tree can persist for 4, 5, 6, 10,000 years. We are affecting the future 10,000 years into the future. I'm all for it as long as we're doing it like this. This is a olive tree in northeastern Spain that was planted by the Romans. What we know about plants is they have specific climatic adaptations. They can only live in certain conditions. This is what I referred to a little bit earlier, that long-term ecosystem change, we can learn about it just by looking at what's there, because we know about these trees, we know how long they live, we know what kind of conditions they like, what soil types they like, what moisture regimes they like, what temperature regime they like. We can tell, like in this case right here, we can tell 4,000 years ago that the conditions were right for chestnuts, more or less within this band of what is conducive to supporting chestnuts. By the way, this is less than 2 miles from the center of the cone of Mount Etna. It's been blown up by volcanoes repeatedly through time. This right here is the largest holm oak, H-O-L-M, Quercus ilex, that's right down the road from the 100-horse chestnut. And what we can do is using our observational skills, we notice how these branches, the tree is only, so this guy's 6 foot tall. Actually, he's a shrimp. He's not a midget, but he's small. He's 5'5" native. So say this is like 8 foot tall to the first branches, and then it's widespread. Trees will behave differently in different conditions, and if they're in the wide open, their branches will spread out more to accept the sun. So this holm oak had been in the full sun for a long time, ever since it was 8 to 10 foot tall. It was in the wide open. Well, then somewhere along the line, we notice these little short trees here that are growing pretty straight and tall, real high density. At some point in time, this was no longer open, and seeds came in, and this young forest grows up underneath it. We can look there, by knowing how fast these plants grow, how old those are, we can tell how long this has been since this was open and grassy. We know a little bit about this village. That particular village was abandoned 1,200 years ago, and all the ruins of the stone are all around this oak tree. Other ways of learning. So one is we can observe the actual vegetation itself, and I'll deal with this in a later episode. But learning how to interpret the history of a place by looking at its landscape is an incredible skill. A lot of trackers have that. A lot of interpretive naturalists have that. Foresters will have that. Very useful skill no matter where we are if we're going to apply it in a restoration agriculture farming situation. Fossils will tell us a lot about the way long ago past, and a lot of pollen from trees, grasses, and so on are also used as indicators to tell us a little bit about the history of our place. These help us these frame the context within which we're doing our particular system. I'd already said this, that plants have specific adaptations to climate. Those adaptations allow them to thrive only within certain climatic limits. So these trees right here, you will not see these trees growing in a tropical rainforest. They're not adapted to it. They have very narrow leaves, probably very waxy leaves. They probably have lots of thorns to prevent browsing. The waxy leaves and the narrow leaves to prevent evapotranspiration, because moisture is such a critical resource. They'll have a thick bark, which is a good defense against fire and browsing by other animals who might find this to be the only food for looks like hundreds of miles around. So since we know that plants only live within certain climatic limits, we know that if we find remains of plants like this, these are black spruce far north in Alaska. They're adapted to very far north where the sun, even though it'll be light, close to 20 hours in the summertime, the sun is really close to the horizon. It just basically rolls along the horizon. So instead of having an umbrella shape to catch the sun overhead, the sun's not overhead. The sun's way down there at the horizon. You get a big, tall, skinny pole to catch the light that way and face the sun all through the day. So if you find the remains of plants like that in a place like this, what explanation do you have as to how on earth could you have found plants like this here? Well, the only explanation that seems to make sense that we can verify with observation is the fact that for a long period of time, landscape ecosystems have undergone major physical changes, possibly by the movement of continents, possibly by mountain building, erosion of those mountains, exploding volcanoes, global climatic changes, and glaciations. The global climatic changes and the glaciations, I think, are probably the most significant ones of why you would find plants like this in a remains of plants like that in a place like this. A great example in a place like this happens to be eastern Tanzania, this picture right here. Up on the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, there are plants like this. Because as remember last week we talked about, the higher up you go is the equivalent, the altitude increases of a northward or a southward move, so it becomes more and more Arctic. Up at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, there are glaciers, there are trees like this, there is tundra. On the equator in Africa, so once upon a time, it was more widespread. It was in places like this. They're found, remains of plants like this are found in river sediments in areas like this that sometimes wash out of the shore, buried in volcanic debris. And yes, there have been redwoods found in Greenland, and the redwoods that were found in Greenland weren't even fossilized. They were just found as glaciers were melting. It's like, wow, check out this wood. What kind of wood is this? It's like, wow, holy crap, it's like redwoods. And redwoods have a very specific climatic zone. So once upon a time, could you imagine this place up here on the left, covered with trees like this? Oh my gosh, that would be so beautiful, so beautiful. Now, we could say, oh yeah, well, Greenland's moved through the eons. Yeah, maybe, and maybe it has done it fast enough to affect that. Or maybe the climate was radically different not too long ago, so different that these trees of Central California, like San Francisco area, could actually thrive there. I think Greenland would look beautiful in redwoods. So pollen analysis is used quite a bit. Pollen grains last a really long time. Their job is to go and pollinate flowers. It's not to decompose real quick. So in a lot of northern lakes and bogs, anaerobic conditions, pollen grains are pulled out with cores, and a record of what types of plants were shedding pollen is able to be seen, and we can count back year after year after year. There was more of these plants this year, this plant this year, and the change in plants casting pollen dominating an area through time can be watched. And it's really weird. I guess I'm strange. I love looking at like the change of vegetation through time from pollen records. One of the things with the pollen records that's really interesting, there is controversy in how you interpret that. And take, for example, Europe. A lot of the, up until right about now-ish, it's under scrutiny right now, it was thought that Europe had been closed canopy forest for like a long time because all the pollen records, there was very little grass, and it was all these different tree species. It used to be more conifers. It was more Arctic, just like, as if it was coming out of the Ice Age, which it was. And then it turned into more temperate zone plants, which it has been more temperate zone, but very few grasses until the agricultural era. Well, one of the researchers at the Oostvaardersplaats in Netherlands, Frans Vera, by observing the Oostvaardersplaats, and you look at the grasses out there, those poor grasses don't stand a chance. They rarely pollinate because all of the large herbivores wandering around. So if you can imagine the Pleistocene and Holocene with all these huge herds of animals going around, grazing all the grass down to nothing, the trees were the only thing that were shedding pollen, and that's why the trees are overrepresented in the pollen record. So this is one way that we can check and verify the change of the ecosystems through time in our area. And another way is through core samples of muds. And if we look at this one right here in the center, the one down on the right, if you think especially in the temperate zones, you've got a lake that's out there and deciduous trees all around. All of a sudden in the fall, the leaves fall off, they kind of float in. It gets cold, so a lot of the organisms in the lake get frozen. They freeze, they die, so there's a layer of organic matter and a layer of dead, dead critters and all that kind of stuff, microscopic critters. And then over time, there's spring sediments, fall sediments, spring sediments, and fall sediments. And you can go through and you count them, and you can count thousands and thousands and thousands of years deep on some of these lakes, seeing a record of what was actually around. You can find leaf fragments, you can find seeds, you can find, of course, pollen, et cetera, in these lake mud cores. And then succession, it's the short-term process within which the long-term processes of plant migration, genetic differentiation occur. So if you can imagine here, this is the Matanuska Glacier in Alaska, just 100 miles north or so of Anchorage. At the toe of the glacier, when this ice is here, there's nothing able to live there. There's no forest. Anything that would be in its way, if the ice happens to start moving, it'll grind over everything. This actually isn't moving forward. This is in retreat. It's more melting in place and kind of going further back up in the mountains. And what it's leaving behind is all the ground up rock that it would have ground off the hillsides here. And the plants colonize this ground up rock. If we go in closer, we look at this, we can see right at the toe of the glacier, we've got these look like almost like sand dunes. Because what happens is the sun shines down, and the sunny side melts first, and it exposed the darker rocks and gravel that then hold the heat, and so we get these piles that look like sand dunes. That's drift, and then this gets colonized by the plants. So we can watch the process of plants colonizing a site after glaciation, which is in miniature what happened right after the ice ages here in North America. And this is some graphic from a book that shows in North America. These are mostly from pollen samples taken from lake cores and observations of plants and successional pathways, how they behave. And it just shows the different 18,000 years before present, 10,000 years before present, 5,000, 2,000. Notice how the plant communities have changed. The movement of these various different groupings of species, of forest types, if you track the movements, you can see kind of where they originated from, and the bigger the number here was a longer ago time. Is that a sentence? Like 14 was a longish time ago. 10 is more recent, 4 is even more recent. And you can just see as the climate had changed, as ice melted and receded, vegetation moved forward. Some moved in a northeasterly direction, some moved in a westerly direction, some moved in a southwesterly direction, and these are all able to be tracked. So now in our work on our farm, this is important to us because we know the historical pathways of where it came from, and then now we can also project based on what we know about weather and climate and current conditions changing. We can now guess as to what direction we should be going in, because our planet is a constantly moving, changing system. We need to adapt to it, because what we can do is we can look at how conditions are changing where we are and maybe be a step or two ahead of climatic change as it occurs in our place. Maybe. We're one of the few organisms that have that opportunity. Other organisms, animals, have to adapt to the conditions as they are. Well, we can help to set up the next conditions, and if we can predict the conditions right, we can set up a system that thrives even better. So this is all important for how we strategize the management of succession on our place. And this is how we got to the point through time as weather changed, soils changed, as biological activity changed, and plant communities changed. The basic physiographic regions, mountains here, major rivers there, bedrock, and climate, those are the two that have been determined over and over again. Those two really set the pattern. And right down, like right here in the whole Sahara area, if you're not growing stuff that's adapted to the Sahara, forget it, you're screwed. It will not look like a boreal forest. It will not look like a tundra. It will look like something like this. So if you're going to be occupying this region operation, you will be imitating the appearance of these plant communities, woody plant communities in that area. What's also interesting is the site conditions, and this actually is really significant when it comes later on to our breeding. These are all pictures of white spruce. This is a white spruce I took a picture of a couple weeks ago on a rock in the middle of Lake Superior. That at least, I counted at least 36 different whorls, so it's at least 36 years old. I'm willing to bet it's probably 100 years old. There's no soil. It's growing in the rock, extremely cold in the wintertime, extremely hot in the summertime, hardly any water. The site conditions will determine what genetic traits. Evidently, this one had some kind of trait that allowed it to survive with a little bit less water than its companions maybe. Whereas this one right over here, a white spruce with all these kids hanging out around it, and the site that it was in perhaps had plenty of water and plenty of another kind of nutrient. These traits that make this one able to survive in the dwarf stage on a rock, in an environment like this, they were outcompeted, they lost. So these plants here can reproduce in this environment, and these ones here reproduce in this environment. And so over time, the plant populations in this area, in Lake Superior, have dropped certain characteristics that just aren't in the gene pool anymore, and you will not see these plants growing like this, even though they could interbreed with one another. And the ones that tolerate extremely cold in the far north may be different ones than here. So the site conditions determine which genetic traits within this organism will propagate, and that's the germline genetics. You know, this parent crosses with that parent, and they have offspring. Half the offspring die because they don't have the traits that allow them to survive. Then they reproduce and so on. So the survival genes in this system here in the rock are the ones that propagate. The survival genes here are the ones that propagate, and so on. That's germline genetics. Well, then individual gene expression itself is you've got a plant. This little one right here in the rock might have some kind of gene sequence in there that's just waiting for the right kind of trigger to cause it to do whatever it is. One of the things that we as restoration ag farmers want to do is we want to start playing with the trees and figure out which ones have epigenetic triggers that cause them to go into hyper-reproductive mode and produce lots of seed or lots of fruit, because that's what we're growing. If we're growing chestnuts for sale, the more chestnuts we get, the better. Some of the things that we also know is the timing of events in order to trigger epigenetic changes. With hazelnut, a little bit is known, but not a whole lot. That it's at about end of July to the middle of August, where I'm at right here, is when that plant gets signals from its environment as to whether to put on catkins to cast pollen next spring and to set up primordia for the making of nuts, female flowers for next year. So sometime in that period of time from mid-July to mid-August, that plant figures out from the site whether it's going to put on nuts next year or not. What are the triggers that make it decide yes? And if I can learn what those triggers are, some folks have said there's a little bit of research evidence that says hitting it with a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer right at that particular time says, oh yeah, conditions are good, I can go ahead and put out a lot of new sites that will turn into nuts next year. These little epigenetic tricks and triggers, we want to be aware of them because they will be tools that we use often in the future. Just looking at some of these plants, their adaptations to their site. When you take plants from all around their range and bring them to place, allow them to pollinate with one another, save those seed, you've now created a land race that's adapted to your site conditions, and it will look different than mine. You can use the same species on your place as I use on my place, and your system will look almost completely different. You live in places in California, you might end up with the same species that look like this. Or you may close the canopy. You might have a lot more environment that look like this. And remember, one of the things that's important that we can use to trigger, we'll use it to manage succession, we'll use it to trigger epigenetic traits in our plants, hyperproductivity, all this different kinds of stuff. We'll use disturbance to change the actual structure of our system to allow for whatever other crops that we have that we prioritize. These are part of our repertoire. And the chainsaw. My place in Maine has been there for a few years, and now my place in Wisconsin is rapidly getting to the place that my primary farming tool is a chainsaw. Back to the natural plant communities. We're going to imitate our plant communities. This is really fascinating if you got time to go back and read this. But it's considered a forest community, the southern oak forest. But then later on, they say down here, the southern oak forest is widespread, but the number and types of oaks, where did it go? Are factors. Okay, for 3,000 years before European settlement, Native Americans used fire extensively to clear and control undergrowth, which encouraged savanna communities with scattered oaks. That sentence right there. This has been observed over and over again, all kinds of archaeological evidence showing that North America has been primarily savanna for as long as time has been around. As long as these species have been in North America, it's been a savanna. And it's only been the past few hundred years that all of a sudden they've grown to these closed canopy forests. So why on earth is an ecological book talking about plant communities talking about this as an oak woodland when it's actually an overgrown savanna? But anyways, I digress. Go to your list of species. If we go plant these species together, the oaks, the hazelnut, violets, trefoils, the nitrogen fixer, blackberry, Solomon seal, dogwood, Sicilies, peanut, sunflower, all of these are marketable products, edible products, and of course we can graze animals in the system. Pine barrens is another one that I've imitated to a certain extent. I'm just going to flip through these. You guys can read them later. All right. Look at the state of Maine right here, okay? This plant community isn't here. So what does that mean for us? Does it mean we can't do it? It's like, well, what conditions caused this plant community to occur in these openings here? There was blowdown, hurricanes, or some kind of clearing opened it up. It's not too far out of the climactic zone. This is the boreal forest up here, lots of spruce and fir and pine. And then we've got, this is mostly, there'd be spruce, fir, and pine, then aspen, birch, beech, mixed northern hardwoods. Well, we can get these things established over here if we imitate the conditions that allowed these to persist where they were. And in the case all around the Northeast here, there was disturbance. So it's 30 years ago now. Myself, my wife, and brother-in-law bought our first clear cut up in this region of Maine right here. And out in that clear cut, I planted several clumps, areas of this. Now you got to understand, 30 years ago, I was just beginning to think about how can I develop a agricultural system that's ecological. How can we produce the food, fuels, medicines, and fibers that we need to persist ecologically and sell as crops? So what I did is I took several different areas and I established groves of these plants. I just planted hundreds of each out in the middle of a clear cut, and then I walked away, literally walked away. There's places that I have not been in 30 years, and I'm convinced, because I just haven't found them yet, that my groves are still there. So what has happened is, out of their range, but it's not necessarily out of their range temperature-wise anymore, because temperatures have been showing a tracking towards warming. They're getting warmer through time. So these site conditions are now more conducive to these species, but these species have to migrate somehow. So if you're down here in central Texas, as somebody's from Texas, well, these species need to migrate down this way somehow. These need to move that way, and they're not necessarily connected by riparian zone corridors anymore. They're not necessarily managed by large herbivores like they have been for the past 990 million years or whatever. We are now important vectors in the migration of these species across the planet. We are now important vectors in the breeding of these plants for higher yielding varieties, more site adapted varieties, more low input varieties. And one way to do that is to go get a whole bunch of seeds, stick them out in the middle of a clear cut, and walk away. So look at this cluster right here and see if you can see all these different plants growing in here. We've got red oak. We've got most of the shrubbery in here is hazelnut. We have some chestnut here. Get some more chestnut going on. There's more chestnut over here. Wild grapes. I don't think there's wild grapes within hundreds of miles. These are Concord type grape. So I've got, this is the same exact system that I'm using in Wisconsin. Now look at the appearance. This is a different site. Instead of on limestone soils, it's on high calcium, it's on granite soils. instead of only 30 inches of rain a year, this is like 70 inches of rain a year. Instead of only 18 to 36 inches of snow, it's like 5 to 7 feet of snow. And one of the things that you see right here, notice how this chunk of vegetation is gone, and then all of a sudden the oak is up here. This is the browse line from moose. Moose just love these plants, and so they're in there browsing. Well, then the ground cover system, we've got raspberries, fireweed. This is a fantastic edible green in the spring, some of the first green that you have. Tansy, which is an outstanding bug repellent. I used a lot of it when I was up there. I already mentioned raspberries. There's wild strawberries growing on the ground. All of those things are growing. These are all food. Most anybody else who would walk there would go there and they would go wild crafting. Well, I'm not wild crafting. This is a farm. I'm harvesting yields. Once again, the grapes. This chestnut over here, where is it? Right down here? The chestnut was flowering when I was up there, so there's going to be a few chestnuts out there for the first time. That's the same exact plant system as on my farm in Wisconsin. Here we go, a couple apples. These are from a seedling yellow delicious apple tree. Moose love eating apple trees. So that right here, same plant community, about the same size as this clump here. This one is in Wisconsin on high calcium soils. That's in Maine on granite soils, much more acidic, much more rain, much more snow, and the presence of large browsing animals. And this is in Wisconsin without the presence of large grazing animals. The Juglandaceae family, based on the walnut. I've done several different groves up there, and unfortunately my pictures of the hickory grove didn't show up. I don't know what happened there. They even took a couple of videos of the hickories. But this is a butternut grove. What's fascinating about this is the darker trees here. These are all butternuts. These are just planted as seed 25, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And it's interesting how they've dominated the site. They do produce juglones, which is a selective herbicide, which evidently a lot of the local Maine underbrush doesn't like. And look what colonizes the site. Grass. It's like, oh my goodness. I can establish pastures in a clear cut in Maine, not by planting grass and using an herbicide to get rid of the natural vegetation. Why don't I establish pastures in Maine by planting butternuts or black walnut or hickories? The hickories are much the same. Beautiful grass growing underneath them. And that's just find it fascinating that you do not and you will not see groves of butternut and groves of hickory interspersed with spruce, fir, birch, aspen, anywhere. This is two different natural systems interacting with one another somehow. The native vegetation of Maine pushing in from the outside. The butternuts are actually reproducing. So you can imagine squirrels and chipmunks taking the nuts and burying them somewhere else. So I've found butternut trees all over the place up here. So now that system is propagating. We've jumped ahead of the climate wave as climate's changing with this particular system by putting in the proper conditions, and we've done nothing to it for 30 years. So this kind of farm here, these are the kinds of systems that we're setting up all over the place, no matter where you are, Texas, California, Sequim, Washington, Huntsville, Alabama, all those different things, Maine, Vermont. We're going to use different plant communities. We have to understand the successional pathway of our place. We understand the larger geological, ecological context that it occurs within. Then we plant these systems and we manage them with minimal inputs in order to have as natural a system as we possibly can. And every yield that we get out of it is pure profit. And that's all I have for the evening. We've gone over time a little bit.
Well, that's awesome. We've got two pretty cool questions that both are relevant. One person asked something, he actually didn't ask the questions. He said he was going to put some questions in that were off topic, and that I just told him we'd answer them another time, and either online or otherwise. But two really good ones. One from Ben that was, no, excuse me, from Niels. No, I'll get it right here. Actually, from Nicholas. In relation to the research papers we talked about, is there an equivalent of this site? And he refers to a physics site and astrophysics. I think he's asking, is there a good summary type site of research papers?
Oi.
in this area?
Wayne talked to Jeffrey. We got more work for him. Uh, Basically, no. The long and short of it is no. You think most ecological, and this I talked about this in the first webinar. Most ecological research is done as pure science to understand. Well, then ecologists, if they want a job, they get into academia, or you start working in like environmental advocacy. You work for the EPA. You do. I worked in site assessments, environmental site assessments. It would go out and would go, describe what was there so they could get a permit in order to destroy what was there. So no one has been really doing experimentation and study of how to move these ecosystems forward through time. Restoration ecology is close, but what they're trying to do there is restore a snapshot of something that was once upon a time, and it's more heavily loaded on how do we get these systems established, and it's heavy on lots of burning and cutting and herbicide. Whereas if you look at this picture right here up on the screen, this was like throw a bunch of seeds in the ground and walk away and let it sort itself out. Who is starting to do research on it is University of Illinois Urbana, woody perennial polyculture research site. I think it's WPPresearch.org, and they do research on site at University of Illinois Urbana, and they partner with the Savannah Institute, who does case studies on farms. There are a couple other universities that are starting to get involved in polyculture research. I know a couple other nonprofits that are starting to get involved with it. The Stewardship Network in Michigan is starting to get involved. Sterling College in Craftsbury, Vermont. University of Missouri Columbia is going to start some polyculture research. So this type of research is just being begun. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this webinar series is I do all this research, and I studied ecology and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, but how is it applicable? Because one of the things with this whole ecolonomics thing is we're not going to just sit back and research and write reports and study and yay, life is good. We're going to take action. We're going to go out and we're going to buy clear cuts, and we're going to set up ecologies like this. This picture right here is a highly productive agriculture system, and I do nothing to it except go in and harvest. And I could be grazing animals in here. I could be having sheep, cows, pigs. I could be having blueberries on the fringes. I'd be selling, blueberries. I could be selling Christmas trees. The mushrooms, oh my goodness, the mushrooms I could be growing up there. I figured out I could remove 300 tons of wood per year in this area just by thinning it. I do that for the next 2,000-3,000 years. What would you do with 3,000 tons of wood that's perfect substrate for mushrooms? How many mushrooms could I produce? It's astounding the agricultural opportunities in a place like this, and we have to do it. We have to take the action, and we can't do it alone. That's why we're a team. And we need you guys to do whatever research you can and synthesize it. Not only do we analyze, we also synthesize. We use both aspects of research, and we're going to put it into action on the ground and report to others. Here, check this out. I just reported on this. How do you like that? I'm pretty proud of it. You should have seen the hickories.
Yeah.
I was mind blown with the hickories.
Great message. Ray asked a really cool question. I just wonder how the Indians tried to control the fires they set. Is there any documentation about this that you are aware of?
How they control it, I don't know. But I do know that there is more and more research on, their using of, and one of the things is with butternut, what's fascinating, I don't remember when I ran into that research, but they were finding, right now the butternut has been declared functionally extinct in the wild because it's not reproducing and spreading. Well, why not? Well, what were the conditions that caused butternut to spread? Well, nobody knows. Well, why was butternut so common once upon a time? Well, for one thing, the natives were heavily utilizing it, and notice all the grass underneath. They were quite likely burning it, so perhaps they were burning episodically, and that was eliminating weevils. Maybe it was getting rid of, there's a bacterial, like a fungal gunk that affects the trees. Perhaps it was reducing populations of that gunk. So it's entirely possible that the butternut depended upon whatever the management scheme was that the Native Americans were using. So I do know that there is research on that. You could probably find it. So is there any one place that has this type of research spun in such a way that it's useful for us as practitioners on the ground? Not yet, but I think that's one of our jobs, because think about it. As this team, we are now like the collegia of practitioners doing this. It is our job to do things, report back to others, and share information, and report to the world what we're doing, because this planet is in pretty serious trouble, and it needs people to do this. It needs us to do this. Nobody else is going to come do this for us. Nobody else has done the research to show us how to do it. It's up to us, and I'm fine with that. Let's go.
Here's a couple of resources, actually, Eric, and just boy, Mark, as you're saying it, people in the community are reacting. Eric put in 2 different titles, and I'm going to put these on the chat here. So one's called Fire, Native Peoples, and the Natural Landscape, and the other one is called, I'm typing and trying to talk and type at the same time, and the Natural Landscape. And the other one is called Forgotten Fires, Native Americans in the Transient Wilderness. So
that's the one that I've read. That's the one that I've read.
Yeah, so thanks, Eric. That's a couple of great ones. Hey, everybody, we have run late, which is great. You're getting a lot of knowledge. Boy, everybody that was here at the start is still here now. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for our staff, Stephanie, Mark, Deb. You guys are great. Mark was good with his slides himself today, so the staff didn't have to even do anything there. But hey, Mark said it. This is a team, man. We've got to set the bar. That's what the whole goal here is. We are very close to 700 members of this team. A lot more people watch replays than ever watch live. I just did a little survey last night, and of our 700 members in the last week, 280 of them have watched at least one of the webinars. And so a lot of people are coming in. Go into the Facebook page, tell everybody about what you do and who you are and why you're interested in whatever you are and what you can do to help other people. Again, we've said it, we're not going to pitch on these webinars, we're going to teach. On the Facebook page, if you've got something that's of some value, put it on the page, tell everybody else about it. What can you do to help? We're going to continue to ask to help. So somebody asked about a summation of resources. Let's figure out how to put that together. I don't have an answer for that right now, but anyway, lots of people are saying thanks, Mark. Thank you, folks, for saying that. And we'll be back together again in a week. Remember, next week we'll have 3 of these like we had this week. Aquaculture on Mondays, hens or poultry on Tuesdays, restoration agriculture on Wednesdays. I'm going to add a 4th section next week, and we'll see how many people attend it to then see if we do it anymore. It's not going to be topical. It's going to be just show up and interact. And I'll come on it for an hour, and if me and one other person are there, we'll interact. If more people come, that's great, and we'll continue to do it. It'll probably be daytime. Sort of the idea is to daytime U.S. Maybe we appeal to more people from other parts of the world that just can't get in here live in the evenings. So anyway, Mark, thanks again. Hopefully those floods don't come tomorrow, and thanks to everybody else. And we will see everybody next week. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.